The Travel Transformation Podcast is proud to be partnered with Give the Goodness Global, an amazing global outreach project helping families in need all over Southeast Asia and beyond. Please check them out at Instagram.com/Give the Goodness Global today. And now on to the podcast episode.
Welcome to the Travel Transformation Podcast, where we talk all things travel and all things transformation, exploring the life-changing potential of solo travel, intentional travel, and location-independent working. Whether you're an aspiring digital nomad or simply wish to boost your confidence through epic travel experiences, I'm here to motivate and inspire you to go after all your wildest dreams. I'm Jessica Grace Coleman, author, certified travel coach, founder of the Travel Transformation Company, and your host for the Travel Transformation Podcast. Travel changed my life. Now let's change yours. You ready? Let's go. Welcome to the Travel Transformation Podcast, where we talk all things travel and all things transformation. My name is Jessica Grace Coleman and I'm your host. And today I'm talking to speaker, author, therapist, and adventure seeker, Crystal Cook. Crystal's vision is to do her part to raise the vibration of the planet, one person at a time, to ultimately launch a butterfly effect. The flutter of a butterfly's wings, she says, is not forceful or commanding, yet that gentle movement can be inspiring with the power of exponential effects. Her own gentle flutter includes speaking engagements, workshops, mental health therapy services, and her Crystalline Vibes children's book series, using playful storytelling through the eyes of beloved animal characters to teach children how to be happier and healthier. In this episode, we discuss her many varied jobs and careers, including being an FBI agent, her children's books and how she uses them to teach children about hope, fear, limiting beliefs, and more, and her travels through Europe and how travel has helped her see the world and herself in a different light. I really enjoyed talking to Crystal about her many, many pursuits, so let's get straight to the interview. Hi, Crystal. Welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you for coming on. Okay, so to start with, can you please give me and our listeners a bit of background information about you, where you're from, what you do, and a little bit about your story so far?
Okay, so I've got a varied background. I started my professional life as a CPA, certified public accountant. Then I thought, this is not really what I want. And so I've always was always interested in law enforcement. So I became an FBI agent and did that for a few years. And I thought, something is missing still, and had some significant changes in my life, and decided to go back to school and get a master's in social work. And I did that 20 years ago. And I always thought, I want to be a traveling social worker. I didn't know what that would look like, but I wanted to travel the world and have adventures. And around 2006, I was able to do contract work with the military, where I would go to different military locations throughout the United States and internationally. And the assignments were sometimes 30 days to 3 months. And then I decided to move to Europe full time. And that was in 2013. And I moved back to the States last year, so a year ago. So I was able to become a social worker.
Great. I have so many questions about all of this. So where do you live now?
Right now I live in Arizona.
Oh, great. Okay.
Phoenix, Arizona.
And I wanted to ask you I read on your website that you grew up in a small Colorado mountain town. And I wanted to ask about this because I love mountains, huge mountain person. And I lived in Boulder, Colorado for a year when I was younger, when I went to university, and I loved it so much. One of my favorite states. So I wanted to ask you whereabouts this town was and what was it like growing up there?
It's in the southwest corner of Colorado. So for people in Europe, they don't understand how big our states are. Sorry, my cat. And so if you're in Boulder, if you drive about 8.5 hours southwest, you hit Colorado. So where I grew up in Colorado was really cool because you could drive in either direction and be in mountains, or you could be in the Red Rock Desert of Utah, or the saguaro cactus of Arizona, or, the different type of desert in New Mexico. And so it was close to ski towns, close to Telluride, close to Durango, and which has now become very popular with tourists and people who have moved to Colorado. But when I grew up, I would say it was primarily ranching families. And so it was just a very small town where a lot of people had been there for generations. And even now, people who've moved in from all different areas. If the local people have been there for several generations, you can live in a house for 40 years or 30 years, but it's still, oh yeah, that's, Ethel's house, then Ethel died maybe, in 1960, but that was Ethel's house. And so the locals really have this history and sense of community from generations back. And I, was back, I'm Generation X, so I grew up back in the 80s, and it was, see you later. We're off on our bikes playing in the river and having adventures all day. And our vacations consisted of going in the mountains and camping. That was what, we didn't go on trips. We went to the mountains, were our trips.
Right. So where did your love of travel come from then? And where did, you said you wanted to be a traveling social worker. So where did that come from?
Where did that love of travel come from? I don't know, because my dad was in the Navy, but otherwise we didn't travel growing up as kids. That was really a luxury. We didn't grow up with the resources and the time to travel. I don't know where that, I think I've always had a curious, adventurous nature. And so just wanting to see what was out there, to experience it. And I don't really know where it came from, honestly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but it also sounds like that adventurous nature sort of went into all the many, many jobs you had as well, because you've tried so many things like you mentioned. And I wanted to ask you about this. It's so varied. Were there sort of transferable skills between these careers? Can you link them in any way, or was it just completely random?
I know. And as people say, how, it's like you're night and day, and not really, because so for law enforcement, in my therapy practice, there's a lot of mental health people who are more touchy-feely and very soft, and I'm not. And I worked for the last 10 years primarily with teenagers, and it doesn't work with teens, I think, to be too soft, to be kind for sure. But with teens, a lot of times there is an element of manipulation or pulling the wool over your eyes. And teens, I think, appreciate the honesty and calling them out on things, but doing it in a very fun and light way. And I think that served me in my therapy practice to not necessarily be bamboozled by things, to really, especially if you're working with family, you're going to get different perspectives. And so if you believe 100% what someone tells you, you may lose sight of the real issue. And to really, I always keep in mind that this is a perspective. This is a version of the story. And unless I see something with my own eyes or hear it with my own ears, I don't really know exactly what happened. So I think the law enforcement side of me kept me having, I think, a very practical, grounded approach to understanding the dynamic, because I think humans tend to fall towards truth, right? Well, they told me, so it must be true. And I don't necessarily fault for truth. I don't assume someone's lying to me, but I don't necessarily, I know that there may be more to the story. So I think that was very helpful for me. And then doing private practice and being an entrepreneur, the accounting skills have been incredibly helpful because I understand the business side. And a lot of entrepreneurs or a lot of therapists, the bookkeeping and the accounting, and a lot of people who are self-employed, they don't like that. But if you don't understand your accounting, you may be losing money and you don't even know. So it's like, even with my taxes, I can save a lot of money because I can do my own taxes or do a big portion of them. So I think they have all linked together because it keeps me, because I can be very much out there and having the background of accountant and law enforcement helps keep me from going kind of out there in the clouds. They're very grounding careers, I think. So I think that's helped me be balanced.
I love that. I love how you've taken sort of bits from all your various jobs and careers, and it's helping you with what you do now. That's really cool. I wanted to ask about how you become an FBI special agent, because it's something so far out of my zone of reference. Is it just something you wanted to be a policewoman and then that turned into that? Or how did you actually get into it?
Right. So when I was a kid, I loved everything to do with murder. It's so, I think I was a strange kid. I did. I loved, it was back before we had CSI. I mean, I think probably a lot of humans are drawn to that. We didn't have those shows when I was a kid growing up, CSI and all the murder type of shows. I just was fascinated by it. We had magazines and I would read the magazines about murders and solving crime. And of course, I read Trixie Belden and Nancy Drew and Harriet the Spy and Encyclopedia Brown. So, I was doing my training, So in my little town, my parents worked a lot and I didn't, we had to entertain ourselves. And so my girlfriend and I, we opened a detective agency and we solved a little small town crime. And I was always drawn to that. And so as I grew up, my mom was like, oh, good gosh, no, you need to do something sensible, become an accountant. So I did. And I was like, this is like so boring. And so I had a college professor that really liked me and said, I have a friend who's an FBI agent. Maybe you guys should talk. And because the FBI hires accountants, because there's a lot of white collar crime and they hire particular areas of expertise, and accountant is one of them. And so he guided me on how to apply, and I applied and I went through the interview process. And it's not easy I don't know how I got in. Maybe there was a mistake, quite honestly. I don't know. Because I did not, they test for personality. So before you ever go in, you get a psychological test. And they're really profiling a particular trait. And I really was very different from the profile trait. And I remember even a colleague at one time said, I don't know how you got in because you're so different, But I think, sometimes the different types of personalities add to the dynamic. And so that's really how I get in. I just, I'm going to try. Well, so this was interesting. I wanted to go to the Peace Corps. I'm going to go to the Peace Corps. And that's what I'm going to do. And I want to learn another language. And so I had all my paperwork in for the Peace Corps. And I was in the process of finalizing everything. And I was playing soccer and I blew out my knee. And this was back in the 90s when medical stuff wasn't as advanced as it is now. So the recovery for blowing out your ACL back then was a longer recovery period. And so that stalled the Peace Corps. And in the meantime, the FBI interest came in. I thought, well, I'll go for that. If I don't get in, then I'll go back to the Peace Corps. But if I get in, then I'll get in. And so that was really kind of that turning point. And I just went for it. I just applied and I kept passing the tests.
I love that. And I also love that it came from like a childhood fascination and your detective agency. That sounds amazing. I always wanted to do something like that when I was a kid as well. And the Nancy Drew books and all that stuff. And actually that kind of links into my next question, because I wanted to ask you about your children's book series. So can you tell me about this? What are they about and what made you want to write them?
Yes. And this is what my passion is now, is the stories. Well, I was doing when I was living overseas, of course, when you have the travel bug, it just consumes you, right? And I was listening to one of your podcasts where your guest was talking about, and I loved her analogy about the tree and the plant and the airplane. I love that analogy. And it's like, yeah, I'm a plant. As much as I have tried to be a tree, they're kicking me out of the tree farm. I'm a plant. And so when I was living overseas, I thought, well, gosh, I'll be a travel writer. So I did a couple of articles for travel writing. And then a teacher friend of mine read some of my articles and said, you know what, you would be a great children's book author. And at the time I thought, is that because my writing is very immature and childlike, And another teacher friend of mine said, no. She goes, there's an art to writing children's books. People think that it's easy because they're short, but to write a good children's book is an art and it's not easy. And she goes, and you should. And so when COVID hit, I wasn't travel writing, although I had a bunch of material to write for travel. I just figured that there was a market for it when no one could travel. And so I thought, well, gosh, as a therapist for 20 years, working with children and adolescents and families, what I would like to do, my vision was, I love fiction, but I love self-help books. I love them. And I get so much out of them. I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a type of a self-help book for kids?
Are you ready for adventure? Are you ready to become location independent? Are you ready to create your ultimate dream lifestyle? Then I have just the thing for you. The Flip the Script Academy with me, Jessica Grace Coleman. My online academy, which is bursting with life-changing courses and resources, is for anyone who feels stuck in life, wants to make a change, would like more meaning and purpose in their life, wants to shake things up, especially after the pandemic, wants to start or grow a business or side hustle they can run from the road, wants to incorporate travel into their lives in all kinds of different ways, or is simply ready for an epic transformation. For more info, just head to traveltransformationcoach.com/academy. And now, back to the Travel Transformation Podcast.
But a kid's not going to read a self-help book, right? Because it's boring. But where they could get the same type of value, because humans were very diverse and very unique. And at the same time, all across cultures, there's commonalities that every human has ever lived have, right? We have all been afraid at some point. We have all judged. We have all been judged. And I wanted something that maybe children who would never, ever have an opportunity to go to counseling, that maybe have parents that would never, ever read to them, would have a book that could give them tools to navigate life and lessons. And so I wrote these stories for that purpose. And my intention was to do it in a way where, and I don't know if you've read books like this, and I haven't, and I think they're quite magical, where you're reading a story and you become so involved in the characters, the characters become your friends, or characters that you don't like because they're the villain. And you become so involved, and the lessons are just woven in there. And you don't even know that you are getting a lesson because you want what the lesson is teaching you, right? And so like the first book, Hope is a Butterfly If You Don't Squish the Caterpillar. I mean, there's different, even in the title is a meaning. The name Hope had a meaning because hope is meaningful, right? We all have hope for something. And so how many times as kids do we squish something or kill something because it's ugly or gross? Or even in movies, right? Like in E.T., the alien, we're going to kill the alien because we don't understand it. And so really wanting to teach that let's not destroy, let's not destroy life just because it's different. And also, how often do we kill our own hopes and dreams before they ever even come to fruition, right? We do it to ourselves, I think, more than other people do it to us. And then the second book, Braveheart, Gracie and the Vacuum Monster, is to teach about fear, because we all have been afraid. And we've got the fear that helps save us and keep us safe. And then there's the fear that holds us back, that irrational fear, the self-limiting beliefs, I think in one of your podcasts, you were talking about your fear of public speaking, right? That's a great example of irrational fear. Right? Like you may be throwing up or, going into hyperventilation before you get up and speak in front of people. But the worst that's going to happen is you're going to feel uncomfortable or embarrassed. You're not going to be physically hurt. And so really encouraging kids to learn strategies to help themselves when they're afraid. But then also I call it the spidey sense fear. I break fear down into 3: rational, irrational, and the spidey sense. And as a traveler, you probably really get that spidey sense, right? Like probably should not walk down this street right now. Or this particular people, yeah, these are great. I don't know them, but it would be fine to spend the evening walking around and touring with them. Or something feels off about this particular person. Maybe I shouldn't, engage. And it doesn't always make sense, but that spidey sense, where the hairs on your neck rise, I think is important for us to listen to as well. And so that's why I created these stories as a way for kids to have fun learning. Kind of remember Winnie the Pooh. I don't know if you had Winnie the Pooh when you were growing up, but a lot of those Winnie the Pooh stories are so sweet, but they have a little nugget of something special in them.
Yeah, I love that so much. I was going to say, I wish I had those books when I was a kid, but I think they would actually help me now as well, because all the stuff you were talking about is all stuff that adults are still dealing with, like the limiting beliefs, the fears, when you said, we kill our own hope, that I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with that, self-sabotage, all that kind of stuff is still so relevant today. So the fact that you're sort of getting in there early and teaching children about this stuff is so amazing. I really, really love it. And I was going to ask you about, you've sort of talked about it there a little bit, but the power of storytelling, because I know you sort of, this is woven into everything you do, and you work with children and students. You work with teenagers as well now?
Mm-hmm. Yes. The storytelling has been around, right, forever. Like even in illogical sites, we see evidence of storytelling. And in culture, storytelling is such a big part of the culture. And it's so powerful because if you can tell a story, that emotional piece wraps around the facts of the story and it becomes entwined and it is embedded in that part of the brain that becomes sticky. I call it sticky. So the lessons are there. Say, for instance, I'm going to just use this example, history. Now, history class to me wasn't very exciting because it was very fact driven. This year, this battle happened and this king, married this queen, and it wasn't, nothing hit for me. Now, I watched the Tudor series. Now, I can tell you about every single one of Henry VIII's wives, their personalities, what happened to them, because when I watched the series, it's a story. And I understood the characters and I became involved with the characters. And there was an emotional reaction, an emotional response that I had. And so those stories became intertwined. And so it's that sticky part of my brain. And so storytelling does that for people. If I can tell a story about fear, I can tell, okay, this is how you handle irrational fear. This is how you handle rational fear and your spidey sense. But if I can tell a story around it and get you engaged and you have this emotional feeling and it sticks in a way. Does that make sense? Like it just, and what's happening in the neural part of your brain is it gets embedded in the emotional part, the limbic system part of your brain.
Yeah, I definitely.
As that emotional piece.
It's so powerful, like you say, and you're right. I was never really into history either because I just couldn't remember all the dates and everything, and it was just the textbooks so boring. And when you, like you say, you're right. If you put a story around it, you sort of weave it into fiction and add all the kind of emotional elements to it. Not only will it stay in your brain and you'll remember it, but you'll have a, like you say, like an actual powerful reaction to it. You'll be able to picture these people, what they were doing. It sort of breathes life into the whole thing. So definitely agree with that. So do you do workshops and speaking on this, or what speaking do you do now?
One of the things I was doing was going into the classrooms with the elementary kids and reading the stories. And the way I read the story, Grace, he wasn't out last school year, but Hope. And now I have puppets that a friend of mine custom made for me, which are so cute. But before that, I had just these little signs with their little pictures on it. And so I would not read, because to me, reading is too distracting for me because I'm holding something up and looking. So I just have the screen behind me with the pictures and the words from the book and the book sitting out so the kids could see that there was a book, and I just tell the story. And almost like a one-person play in a way. It's just kind of silly, but I put memorize, right? I wrote it, so I might as well memorize it. And then I can make eye contact with the kids. And then I would do a few pages and then we would stop and talk about what was going on. And that was incredible because it brought out things that I never anticipated, ever. Like I wanted the kids to understand the story, but I never expected that they would go a deeper level. For instance, there's a part in Hope where Samantha's going to squish her. The little girl's going to squish her. And there's a spider and a mouse and a bee looking on in horror. And the little caterpillar's looking up at this big foot. And so we were talking about, like, I wanted to get empathy, right? Like these other little characters, it's not happening to them, but talking about empathy and teaching them empathy. And what was interesting is we were talking about that, and the kids were saying they were coming up with ideas of how the spider and the mouse and the bee could help Hope as a team. They were coming up with these creative ideas. They could scare the little girl. They could wrap a spider web around her. There's all about a team, the three of these characters working together to help her. And then a couple of the kids, of course, would say, well, the mouse could bite her. And I was like, that's true. And then, well, the bee could sting her. Like, that is true. And I didn't say anything. I didn't argue, just that that's an option. And then every single time that this happened, a student would say, at all levels, from kindergarten up to 6th grade, but what if she's allergic to bees? What if Samantha is allergic to bees and she dies, or she gets hurt, or the mouse hurts her when she bites her? And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so incredible that it went beyond saving the caterpillar to actually caring about the villain. We want to save the caterpillar, but we don't want to hurt the villain. I was like, wow, that is empathy at another level, because because usually let's get that villain. We don't like her, but it wasn't. They still cared about her. So that's, in answer to your question, that's one thing I did do is go into the schools and teach the books and teach the lessons in the book and how to get the most out of the book, and then talk to high school students about fear. And I can do that just by talking and not having anything, just talking about my own life and engaging them. And also, depending on what the situation calls for or what the adults want, the educators, I can use Braveheart Gracie and the Vacuum Monster, not to read to them, but use it as a guide because the art is very rich. The artist that I use is fantastic. And so use it as, how did the artist convey fear in this? What is it about this particular piece that she did? And they could pick it out. So then they're getting this knowledge about art appreciation and art interpretation. Or how do you use words to describe fear? Like kind of like a literature lesson or a writing lesson or creativity. So I can use it that way as well. And just talking to them about fear, because again, it's something we all have. And those self-limiting beliefs can hold us back. Because a lot of the kids that I worked with, teens, it's amazing. I feel like teens now have a lot more anxiety than they did when I was a kid. Even going to McDonald's and ordering something, a lot of them were afraid to do that. A lot of social anxiety. And my opinion is that the social anxiety has emerged from so much technology, because it's easier for them to have conversations on their phone than to look at someone and have a conversation. And so teaching them skills on how to have a conversation with another human, how to get in front of the classroom and give a presentation. That was a common theme for a lot of the kids. And so teaching them that, hey, this is an irrational fear. It may not ever be easy, but here's some things you can do to make it tolerable so that you can get better and not let that hold you back.
I love this so much.
And then just do stories.
Yeah, I always think that I'm so glad I grew up before everyone had a smartphone at school, because like you say, you're just messaging each other all the time. But also there's, these days, everything you do, anything slightly embarrassing, someone's probably going to film it and like put it online, or, it's like that whole extra terror of high school, and teenagers have a lot more to deal with in that way than we did. And I love that you're going in and using your books as like a tool to teach them. Do you do this with like your local schools? So you just go and ask like the principal if they want someone to come in, or how does that work?
So like with the elementary schools, yeah, I would just go to the local area where people knew me and said, hey, I've got this book. And that's how I would get in. And then with a lot of the teenagers, I do the conferences, apply for the conferences. There's a lot of, nowadays it's really cool. Like when I was in school, they had a couple of conferences, but now that there's clubs for so many things, future healthcare leaders, and there's so many future educators of America. And so they have so many clubs, and it's so great for kids because they can go to like these regional conferences, and at these regional conferences, they have speakers that come in. And so, and I am actually fairly new at it, because I've just been back for a year. So, talk to me a year from now and I'll tell you exactly everywhere I've been. But right now I'm still it's at the local level and just kind of like doing this one and then doing this one and then doing this one.
No, that's great. I love it. It's such a great idea, especially because I'm a writer as well. But the thought of, actually using your book, going in and teaching it to people in person in the lessons is just really, really great. You mentioned that you lived and worked in Europe for several years and that you did quite a bit of traveling in that time. Can you tell me about your travels, where you lived, all that kind of stuff?
I loved it. Like I said, when you get the travel bug, it's just there, isn't it? I lived in Bavaria. So on the eastern side of Europe, about 90 minutes northeast of Munich, and not too far from the Czech border. And I tend to, that was the first place I lived. I need to answer your question first before I head off in another direction. Then I lived there for 3 years, and then I lived in northern Italy, in Aviano, which is about 90 minutes northeast of Venice. And I lived there for 4 years. And then for the last 2 years, I lived in the western part of Germany, closer to the French border, not too far from Frankfurt. And I love off the beaten path type of adventures. Paris is beautiful. London is fantastic. I prefer the hidden gems that you would only know if you knew a local person. I think when you live in a place, you get that advantage of finding the local treasures. And then I feel like Eastern Europe is less traveled by Americans in Western Europe. So I loved going to the Czech Republic. I loved going to Hungary and to Bulgaria and to Croatia and to all of those places more on the eastern side. I think more people are going there now, but when I lived there, it was, not as many Americans there. And Morocco, I loved. And what I loved living in Europe is Americans typically don't have a lot of time off of work. And so when I lived in Europe, I was able to do a lot of weekend trips. So they're fast. You don't really get to spend a lot of time in a location. So I always wanted more. But at the same time, I was still able to do it. So I could take a weekend trip to Prague, easy. I could take spend a weekend trip in the Amalfi Coast or, all these different places. I would just pick something, and let's go to Sardinia. And you can get the little budget airlines. And so it can be pretty affordable. I was really good at affordable travel.
And that's what's so good about Europe. Everything's so close. You can just sort of like hop from country to country if you've only got a couple of days. And I definitely need to explore Eastern Europe more because I've not really been to many places there. So yes, definitely on my list. What would you say is the biggest lesson you've learned through travel or through living abroad in general?
I think the biggest lesson, and I think we're moving in this direction, is that as humanity, when we don't see each other as the otherness, right? As us, as humans, I think truly like we all, there's different cultures, different food, different ways of life. And at the same time, we're all humans who want to be happy, and we all have emotions, and we all have fear, and there's so much commonality. And when you travel, I think it changes your worldview perspective in many ways. You just, I think, I don't know, there's more of I think a desire to reach across that cultural barrier or even that communication barrier and just get to know the other person. I've had full on conversations with people and we don't even speak the same language. I don't know if you've experienced that where you're like, I'm saying something, they're saying something. And my sister-in-law is Bulgarian and her family does not speak any English. And she's, of course, speaks both. And when I traveled back to visit her family with her brother and I and her mom and I would just have these conversations. And she didn't realize that she sat once at a cafe and she's like, oh my gosh, she goes, you guys are just talking away. I go, oh yeah. She's like, but you're really talking about the same thing. Like you're having a conversation. And she was like, how are you doing that when you don't understand what each other's saying, but you're actually having a conversation that makes sense? Like she was making sense of what we're saying. She was tracking. And her brother said, I can see it in her eyes. We have a communication eye to eye. There's a humanness communication that happens. Now you couldn't have like a conversation where you needed to plan something, that was important, or where the communication was important, but you have that human connection, don't you think, where you just have that, where you look in someone's eye and they see you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and there's so much generosity, like for people that like an American that they don't even know, like, here, eat this food, here, try this. And we want to share our culture with you. We want to share our way of life with you. And I just think that's just so incredible to experience.
Yeah, totally agree. And like you say, when you're connecting with people in person, spending time with them, looking in their eyes and that kind of stuff, it does completely get rid of the otherness, the them and us. It just shows you that we're all the same. We're all people. We all have the same fears and stuff like you were mentioning before. We may have cultural differences, but at the core we're the same. And there's no reason why you should be thinking of them and us. It's it's just everyone in the world. And that's what I love about travel and how it opens your eyes and makes you see the world in a different way and makes you see yourself and your position in the world in a different way as well. So love it as well. Obviously we both have the travel bug. We could talk about this for hours, but I have just two last questions. So 2 last quick questions. First of all, where can people find and follow you online? And is there anything else you want to mention or any last message you want to get across before we go?
Actually, I would say that about travel, the food. Oh my gosh. I've experienced such amazing food. But the other thing is, I think what it's done for me is realize that me and my world and my problems, they seem smaller when I can see the bigger picture. And so I think that has helped me with my fears is like, oh my goodness, I'm worried about this situation and I get a bigger perspective. But where to follow me is on my website, of course, www.crystal.cook.com. Instagram is, I think it's Crystal Cook LCSW, and LinkedIn, Crystal Cook LCSW as well. And then there's a Facebook page, Crystal Cook LCSW.
Great. And we'll put those in the show notes as well. So people can just go and click on those too. So, right, that's it. Thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for listening to the Travel Transformation Podcast with me, Jessica Grace Coleman. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could please subscribe, rate and review, and spread the word, because it's my mission to help as many people as possible to flip the script on their lives and transform through travel. And remember, life is short, so let's make sure it's nothing short of amazing. Until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.